Destiny. Part 2. Beyond the Walls. Chapter 9. Witches and Wizards. The morning after Mylo's departure, the gates of the fortress of Enkad were abuzz with activity. A tall man and a squat, dark-haired woman were spotted making their way toward the fortress, their presence enough to draw attention. Riders were quickly dispatched to escort them closer to the gates. As they arrived, the guard on duty looked down at them with a scrutinizing gaze. "State your business," he commanded. One of the escorts spoke up. "They claim to be here to see Mylo." The guard raised an eyebrow. "There is no one by that name here," he said bluntly. The woman spoke with an almost mocking grin. "Perhaps you know him by the name Ulgrim. We are old friends of the good man, and of the elephant." "Your names?" the guard asked suspiciously. The woman, short but solid in stature, spoke first. "I am Ranvia." She paused, glancing toward her companion before continuing. "And this is Harose. Tell Mylo we've come to see him. He may be expecting us." By this time, old Whitfurrows had become aware of the disturbance at the gate. Feeling a stir of unease, he hobbled his way to the platform above the guardhouse and peered down at the visitors. To the townsfolk below, the two strangers appeared as nothing more than a handsome couple seeking a friend. But Whitfurrows, his ancient eyes clouded with foresight, saw them for what they truly were. The woman and the man were cloaked in an aura of darkness, their shapes flickering like shadows wrapped in a sickly black flame. He could feel their malice and knew instantly, these were the ones the omens had warned of. Standing tall despite his age, Whitfurrows raised his cane high, the wood creaking under his grip. His voice rang out, clear and booming. "A friend of no one here, you are," he shouted, and the crowd below fell silent, turning toward the old man. In that instant, something strange happened. Whitfurrows seemed to grow before their eyes, his form towering over them as if infused with some unseen power. The air around him shimmered, and a sudden radiance, as bright as the morning sun, enveloped him. "From whence you came, go back," he thundered, his voice echoing across the square. He waved his cane in a wide arc, the gesture carrying with it an undeniable force. The townsfolk watched in stunned awe as the meek old man transformed before their eyes. No longer the humble figure they knew, Whitfurrows stood like a beacon of light, his presence overwhelming. And in that same moment, the true nature of the visitors was revealed. The woman, once seemingly ordinary, now stood exposed for what she truly was, short, stout, not old but not beautiful either, draped in a jet-black robe that billowed in the wind. Her conical hat was bent and malformed, and the besom she carried, gnarled and twisted, glowed with a faint purple mist. The man beside her, tall and repulsive, bore a bald head and was draped in shadowy dark garments. The air around them seemed to pulse with dark magic. Whitfurrows continued his tirade, his voice cutting through the tension. "Daughter of the Scourge of Westwood, thee, I name, Alisar the Terrible." The woman's lips curled into a sneer. "Anne, I name thee." She raised her hands, her fingers twitching as she spoke. "Olar the Foolish." Her voice dripped with contempt. For one last time Olar the Clever came forth from old Whitfurrows, and his cane began to swirl with an ocean blue flame. The last remnants of his magic, long dormant, began to awaken. As he grasped his cane tightly, it began to hum with energy and swirl with a brilliant ocean blue flame. "My friend, you will not harm," he cried. "By flame and by sea, by soil and by wind. Know when you come for him, he will." He stealthily aimed the cane toward them and outshot a beam of gray light which struck and engulfed them in dark smoke. The witch paused for a moment, her dark eyes narrowing as she gathered herself. "That will be your last spell, old man," she sneered. With a swift, deliberate motion, she swept her besom through the air, and a wave of magenta energy surged forward, crackling with malevolent force. The blast struck Whitfurrows, lifting him from the platform as if he were no more than a ragdoll. His body was hurled violently to the fortress floor below with a sickening thud. In that final moment, Olar the Clever exhaled his last breath, his form slumping lifelessly. "Seize them," the guard shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. The escorts, dismounted and already drawing their swords, advanced cautiously toward the witch and her companion. The witch gave a twist of her besom, causing an explosion of black and purple smoke, leaving the escorts coughing and sputtering. When the smoke finally cleared, the witch and her companion were nowhere to be found. The townsfolk stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. Most were too shaken to even utter a word. No one had the slightest suspicion that Whitfurrows had any magical powers, and now he was gone. And not only that, but his murderer was a witch and was on the loose. The elders of the village searched everywhere for Mylo in hopes that he might be able to shed some light on the morning's events, but they soon realized that he too had vanished along with his belongings, and also Jack. Riders were dispatched in hopes to find the witch and to find Mylo before the witch found him. Burdoc adjusted the flame, and the craft slowly began its descent, drifting down about 200 feet. Dark, foreboding clouds gathered in the southeast, rolling in like a storm of destiny. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, a sound of warning. A light mist of rain settled on the craft, the droplets cold and biting as they splattered against the canvas. As he descended, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Horsemen, their figures barely visible through the downpour, riding north into southern Gleemandrade. The familiar yellow and green colors of the COL army fluttered in the storm. Burdoc's heart tightened. Wizard hunters, he thought. They will come for me soon enough. He clenched his jaw. He had to protect his wife, and that meant taking action quickly. Ignoring the worsening weather, Burdoc made a decisive move to ascend once more, determined to catch the mighty winds building with the storm. He climbed to the side of the craft, fumbling as he released the large sail-like parachute. The cloth unfurled with a snap, catching the winds and pulling the craft northward. His thoughts drifted momentarily, back to his youth. The school of philosophy he had attended was no more. All those books, gone, and so many rare volumes, he mourned inwardly. An angry surge passed through him, but he quickly focused on his mission, his mind sharpened with purpose. The closer he got to home, the more ferocious the storm became. The rain turned torrential, pouring down in sheets, as if the heavens themselves sought to drown him. Buckets of rain poured into the cabin, threatening to extinguish the flame that kept the craft aloft. His horse, Apex, was becoming increasingly spooked. The animal whinnied, thrashing, its hooves pounding against the floor, sending waves of motion through the craft. Burdoc gripped the controls with white knuckles, trying to steady the ship while comforting his steed. The wind howled, now a maddening force, and the balloon swayed violently. "Apex, lie down," Burdoc shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. But the horse only bucked harder, eyes wide with panic. Burdoc wiped the rain from his face, vision blurring. "Apex, damn it. For your own safety, lie down." His command was desperate now, as the craft pitched dangerously, threatening to tear apart under the strain. The wind howled louder. The balloon tipped steeply, throwing Burdoc off balance. He slipped, crashing against the side of the craft, his body sliding uncontrollably across the soaked floor. He gripped the railing, hauling himself up, his soaked hands trembling. The controls were barely responsive. He fought to stabilize the craft, but the storm was winning. Apex, tethered by the chain, slid uncontrollably across the cabin floor, his hooves scraping against the wet wood. The chain snapped, the wooden beam that held it cracked under the strain. Apex lurched toward the edge. Burdoc lunged forward, reaching for the horse, but Apex was already halfway over the side. His back legs dangled in the air as the craft tipped again, the rail snapping and falling away into the blackness below. In a panic-fueled blur, Burdoc grabbed the harness with one hand and clutched the steering wheel with the other. He fought to stay anchored, but his strength was failing. A sharp cry escaped him as his grip started to slip. The horse continued to struggle, kicking violently. Just when Burdoc thought his horse was lost, the craft pitched in the opposite direction, sending Apex careening toward him. Burdoc rolled aside just in time, his heart racing as the horse somehow managed to scramble back to his feet. Burdoc quickly reached for his pack, pulling out a sturdy rope. He tied one end securely around the steering post, his hands moving with practiced urgency. The balloon tilted again, pitching violently, and Burdoc's stomach lurched. The horse was sliding toward the broken rail once more. With a swift motion, Burdoc grabbed for the rope, sliding it around Apex's harness. He fastened the knot just in time, pulling the horse back from the edge. But as the craft continued to tip, Burdoc's footing gave way once more. He grabbed desperately at anything he could, but his hands just slipped off the drenched surfaces. His heart hammered in his chest as he reached for the broken stub of the railing, his fingers scraping against the wood. He held on, every muscle screaming, his body straining against the force of the storm. When the craft pitched again, Burdoc knew he couldn't hold on much longer. "Apex," he cried out, his voice raw with panic. His eyes locked with the horse's, the two of them connected in that split second before Burdoc's grip failed. As he fell toward the earth, he remembered Mylo's words, humans were not meant to fly. Mylo and Jack continued on following the Quicksilver River. The goal was to get to the River Orlac, then head north, but after that, it was uncertain. By midday they grew hungry, so they stopped. Jack grazed while Mylo found a productive fishing spot. It was an old dam with a rundown gate and tower. It looked like it hadn't been in use for quite some time, but it was holding back a good deal of water and made for great fishing. He only had some old line and some hooks and no pole, but it would be sufficient for small fish. As he sat by there fishing, he let his mind wander. Would I ever find peace again? He wondered. Why does it always feel like someone's out to harm me when I've never meant anyone any ill will? He sighed, looking out over the shimmering river. How did I get so wrapped up in all this madness? Maybe I should just go to River's Edge, he thought. What difference would it make? Would anyone's life be any better or worse if I left Ashdoran altogether? At least there, he could get a new start, maybe enjoy a bit of calm. All I'd have to do is follow the river south. He muttered the words aloud to himself. Just follow the river south, he repeated, almost wistfully. But then, the wind shifted. A dark cloud began to gather above him, blotting out the sky and spreading across the horizon like a shadow cast by some unseen hand. Not now, he groaned. Where did those clouds come from, Jack? I haven't even built a shelter yet. Just then, he felt a strange warmth radiating from his pocket. He reached in and found the beads that Burdoc had given him. They were growing warmer in his hand. That's odd, he thought, puzzled. If they get any hotter, maybe I can use them to start a fire. He glanced at them again, unease prickling at the back of his mind. Mylo. Someone comes this way, said Jack. It might be who Whitfurrows warned you about. Mylo leapt to his feet and began in Jack's direction when he realized that the visitors were not far from Jack, who was over by the shore. There is no time, Mylo. They're here, go. I will meet you at the mouth of the river, said Jack frantically. Mylo saw the duo. They were now close enough so that Mylo could see the witch's sinister grin as she moved closer. Mylo, I presume, cackled the witch, her malice evident. Instinct drove Mylo forward. He ran across the bridge, and beneath the dam where he spotted an old raft, weathered but still sturdy enough to float. Without hesitation, he charged into the water, pushing the raft out and clambering aboard. He grabbed a piece of driftwood, trying to paddle, but the current was barely moving, the water sluggish and uncooperative. Panic began to claw at him. The witch and her henchmen were crossing the bridge now, moving swiftly toward him. The necklace is stashed on Jack, he realized with dread. Burdoc had given it to him for just such a moment. But there was no time now. His heart thudded in his chest. He could hear the witch's mocking voice echoing across the water. We just want to talk with you, Mylo, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging like an eternity. Mylo's hands shook as he struggled with the raft. The witch's evil grin remained in his mind's eye, ever present, even as she moved soundlessly through the brush and into the shallow water, getting closer with every heartbeat. He could almost feel the cold of her stare, chilling the air around him. They were only 20 feet away now. His breath came in shallow gasps. There was no escape. He had no choice. With trembling hands, he drew his slingshot and quickly assembled the arrow attachment. Reaching into his pack, he recovered the last arrow he had left. He aimed at the witch, every nerve in his body screaming to take the shot. Her grin seemed to grow impossibly wide, as if daring him to fire. Mylo raised the slingshot, steadying his aim as he released the arrow. It flew just over the witch's head, slicing through the rope that held the counterweight in place. The witch turned to glare at him, wagging her finger in mock reproach, clearly thinking he was trying to hit her. But the rope's final thread snapped, and with a loud, crashing thud, the counterweight plunged to the ground. The dam wall began to lower with a deafening groan, gears grinding and smoking as the floodgates opened. A torrent of water roared through the breach, surging toward them. The force of the flood was immense. The witch and her companion were swept off their feet, crashing into the river with a collective scream. The surge sent Mylo's raft surging, caught in the wild current and spiraling downstream. The witch, now soaked, scrambled to her feet, fury flashing in her eyes. She aimed her besom with a snarl, sending a burst of red energy over Mylo's head. We will find you, she screamed, her voice laced with venom. You won't escape us. Her laughter rang out, a dark and twisted sound that echoed across the water. Mylo's heart pounded in his chest, but the force of the flood carried him swiftly downstream. As the witch's presence faded from sight, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The current was swift now, and he could barely see her or her companion in the distance. The point where the Quicksilver River emptied into the Orlac was near. He let out a breath. That was a witch. A real witch. The thought settled uneasily in his mind. And she didn't want to, just talk. She wanted to kill me. Ahead, the mouth of the river came into view. Mylo steered the raft toward the shore and waited for Jack. He gazed out at the mighty Orlac, knowing if he just followed it south, it would bring him to river's edge, but he needed to find Jack. His instincts told him he should heed Whitfurrow's warning and head north once he found Jack. He couldn't afford to wait long with the witch not far behind. Elsewhere, the witch and her companion were already regrouping. It won't be long before the fool can tell when we are close to catching him, complained the witch. He is probably headed north to the Mount of Aspara, she cackled. We must stop him before he gets there, said the man. Yes, Lauread, she began. By luck we stumbled on him this time, and thanks to the old fool Olar, I cannot sense his location until the spell wears off. How long? Said Lauread. Nearly 3 days, snapped the witch. Until then we must rely on your skills as a tracker. That is why you are here, is it not? Correct, but the elephant will lead us to him, added Lauread. No, said the witch in a low voice. We mustn't let the elephant reach him in the slightest, she said as she wrung out her water-soaked shirt and followed her companion. Understood, said Lauread. Will you? Use mind control on the elephant, then? No, he is an Enoi. Mind control magic doesn't work on them. But a bond-breaking spell of forgetfulness will do the trick. At least for a while, but we have to find the animal first, said Alisar. Why not kill the elephant too? Asked Lauread. Why bother? Replied the witch, pretending not to be concerned. Although she knew that it was in bad taste even for a witch to kill an Enoi. And perhaps even bad luck. It didn't take long for Lauread to find Jack's trail. Quickly they began after the unsuspecting elephant. The witch's short legs couldn't carry her half as fast as Lauread's, so she rode upon his back until they spotted Jack. She then stepped down and began her evil spell. Jack the mighty. Jack the strong. This bond you've had for far too long. Bonds be cut. Bonds be broke. I free you now of this yoke. And with that, she gave a shake of the besom, and yellow rays of sparkling light went out from each of the straw bristles and enveloped Jack. He flinched and shook his body and his head and stomped away. A dark sadness fell upon both Mylo and Jack. Jack had completely forgotten about Mylo and went about grazing and wandering. Burdoc felt a sudden jolt. Before he could process what had just happened, a familiar voice rang out over the thunder and rain. "We have you, old friend," exclaimed the voice, clutching Burdoc's arm tightly. It was Rowler the Wise, riding atop Spirit Glider, Rowler's enormous bird. "Rowler," Burdoc shouted, his voice strained against the storm. "Apex, he is still on the craft." "We bring you to ground, then bring down balloon," Rowler said in his heavy accent, his tone calm despite the tempest. Spirit Glider gently descended and released Burdoc onto the earth below. Rowler quickly unpacked a sturdy rope, attaching a metal hook to one end. They ascended once more, Spirit Glider circling the floundering balloon with precision. Rowler waited for the perfect moment, then threw the rope. It caught on one of the balloon's cables, and with a signal from Rowler, Spirit Glider began to tow the craft toward safety. The great bird flapped its wings powerfully, gradually guiding the balloon toward the ground. Burdoc watched, his eyes locked on the scene, both fascinated and relieved. As they neared the earth, he sprinted toward the balloon, quickly climbing aboard to put out the flame before leading Apex down to solid ground. The horse bucked and stomped, running in circles as though overjoyed to be back on stable earth. Burdoc tied the craft to a tree, making sure the wind couldn't drag it away. "She's taken some damage," he muttered to himself. "I won't be going anywhere tonight in this rig." Rowler landed nearby, dismounting from Spirit Glider. "What are you doing flying about in this storm?" Burdoc asked, his brow furrowed. "I could ask you the same question," Rowler replied. "Wizard gathering in Keskipi Mountains. Urgent business." "Another gathering?" But the guild already had their yearly moot. Burdoc raised an eyebrow, securing the balloon. "Must be important." Rowler stepped closer, his voice lowered. "You need not worry about that. The storm will pass soon." Burdoc paused, eyeing Rowler curiously. "Oh! You should come to gathering. Wizardkind not safe unless they work with the COL." Burdoc nodded gravely. "That's why I've come back this way. Meredith is in danger." Rowler's gaze sharpened. "Both of you should come. Together." "Keskipi?" Burdoc looked up, unsure. "That's a long journey." "Not when go by air," Rowler said with a sly grin. "Many travel by horse, some walk." "Why hold the gathering way out there?" Burdoc shook his head, wringing the water out of his soaked hat. "What's this all about?" "Far from the eyes of COL," Rowler explained. "A Baruni tribe near the fortress become wizard friends. Help with gathering." "Another tribe of Baruni in Keskipi?" Burdoc asked, surprised. "I had no idea." Rowler nodded. "We go, get Meredith, bring her back here." Burdoc mulled over the plan for a moment. "Yes, very good. Once the storm subsides, I'll patch up this old rig, gather supplies, and then we move." Burdoc hesitated. He didn't want to leave the balloon unattended, but the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. He needed to explain everything to Meredith, why they had to leave their lives behind and embark on a dangerous journey. With a resigned sigh, he glanced back at the balloon one last time. "We should get moving," Burdoc said, more to himself than to Rowler. With that, the two wizards turned northward, the storm's fury still roaring above them. Mylo sat on the river bank, tossing pebbles into the mighty river as he waited for his Enoi. Again he imagined himself being effortlessly carried down the river on the raft heading toward river's edge. The witch would never expect it after all, he mused. But once again reality crept in. Jack knew the plan was to head north, and if Jack didn't find him at the mouth of the river, north is where he would look. Mylo could wait no longer, for Jack fear gripped him as he imagined the worst, that the witch had somehow harmed his companion. He clung to the fragile hope that they might still meet up again as he traveled, but he couldn't afford to wait any longer. After finding a suitable walking stick from the driftwood lying about, he stretched, releasing the tension from his body, and began his trek north. Suddenly, he felt the familiar warmth in his pocket, the beads that had heated up before the witch's appearance. He looked south and saw a dark cloud gathering on the horizon, moving toward him. The witch was coming. Gripping his sword schema with one hand and the beads in the other, Mylo ran north along the riverbank, his breath coming fast. He ran until the beads grew no warmer than the warmth of his hand, signaling that the witch was not immediately upon him. He paused to catch his breath and drink from his water flask, his body heavy with exhaustion. The river here wasn't as wide as it was farther south, but it was still far too broad to cross. There were no towns or bridges in sight for miles, just a worn footpath winding along the bank. To the west lay the wastelands, desolate and barren, while to the east, the land began to show signs of life, with patches of green and trees dotting the horizon. North, towering mountains loomed in the distance, the source of the mighty river. With the mountains as his goal, Mylo fixed his gaze on them and walked, driven by the knowledge that staying close to the river would guarantee food and water for the journey. His feet ached and his legs burned with the strain of the long trek, but he pressed on. That night, he set up camp under the cover of trees, wary of starting a fire, knowing his pursuers couldn't be far behind. As he drifted to sleep, his thoughts darkened. If I die out here, will anyone ever know what happened to me? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer. By the third night, hunger and weariness had taken their toll. His pack was empty, the last of his provisions consumed, and most of his supplies were still with Jack. The beads had remained cool for some time, so he thought it safe to start a fire. It would help warm him and cook the fish he'd caught earlier in the day. The thought of comfort made him ache with longing for the safety of the fortress. He missed the peace of that place, the feeling of security, the chance to simply live without constantly fearing for his life. A dark thought flickered through his mind. Maybe it would be better to face the witch and get it over with. That night, he built the fire larger than the one before, hoping its warmth would push back the cold and his doubts. In the middle of the night, he was jolted awake by a shrill screech and a crashing noise nearby. His heart raced as he checked the beads. They were burning hot. Mylo scrambled to gather his belongings and douse the fire. He took off running, but the darkness around him swallowed the trail, making it impossible to see. As the beads cooled, his frantic sprint turned into a fast walk and eventually a weary trudge. The first light of dawn found him with no trace of the river trail, but the mountains were still there, their imposing peaks pointing the way north. His stomach growled, the breakfast he had planned now lost at his last campsite. He was left with only some overripe berries, barely enough to satisfy the hunger gnawing at him. His legs burned from the days of walking, and this morning's unexpected sprint had only made it worse. Burdoc and Rowler arrived at his home, the familiar stone walls standing in stark contrast to the urgency of the moment. As they approached the door, they found that it was barred from the inside. "Mary! Mary!" he shouted, pounding on the door, his voice desperate. His mind raced. He was about to break a window to gain entry when, to his relief, the door creaked open. "Bertie!" Meredith cried, her eyes wide with relief, and she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. Burdoc's heart tightened as he held her close, momentarily forgetting everything else. "Meredith, why in the world was the door barred?" he asked, pulling back slightly to look at her, concern still etched on his face. Rowler, waiting patiently by the door, gave them a moment before Meredith replied, her voice tinged with a mix of anxiety and frustration. "Rowler's bird. I barred the door and hid in the basement, just like you told me to, if there was danger. I didn't know it was the two of you." She released her embrace, stepping back, but her eyes searched his, a flicker of hurt there. "And you've been gone for months, and all I've heard from you are a couple of letters. Bertie, please, tell me you're finally home." Burdoc's expression softened, but he knew there was no time for explanations. "Unfortunately, my dear, we must leave, both of us this time." "Go, gather what you can, but we must leave quickly." Meredith froze for a moment, her confusion deepening. "What? For Ariad's sake, what is going on? You want me to leave? And where shall we go?" "We are both in grave danger if we stay here," Burdoc said, his voice low but urgent. He took a step toward her, his hand on her arm, as if grounding them both in the gravity of the situation. "I promise you I'll tell you everything on the way, but we must go now." Meredith looked at him, her brow furrowed with a mix of worry and frustration. But she saw the seriousness in his eyes and knew this wasn't a request. With a resigned nod, she turned and hurried inside, gathering a few belongings as Burdoc followed. Once they had everything packed, Burdoc helped retrofit the giant bird with one of Apex's old saddles. Rowler was already preparing to leave, the great bird rustling its feathers as if eager to take flight. Burdoc's eyes met hers and gave a nod, a silent promise that everything would be all right. Before long, they reached the balloon, and Rowler was soaring into the sky toward the gathering in the mountains. Burdoc worked quickly, making the necessary repairs to the craft. Meredith stood by, watching him with a quiet intensity. As the final fixes were made, Burdoc looked at her, his face weary but determined. "It's going to be a long, cold flight, but I will explain everything." Meredith nodded, the weight of the situation settling in. As the balloon lifted off into the sky, the wind rushing around them, Burdoc told her everything. He spoke of the danger they faced and of the gathering in the mountains. As the story unfolded, Meredith's expression changed from confusion to understanding. She realized, slowly but surely, that her life, everything she had known, was about to change forever. Mylo had been walking for several hours, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His eyes scanned the horizon, but still, no sign of the river trail. He had been trying to navigate northeast and sometimes due east, but with every step, the river remained elusive. Perhaps the river twisted eastward for a while, he thought, trying to make sense of the landscape. Up ahead, he spotted what appeared to be a clearing or patch of sand. His hope surged as he moved closer, only to realize it was a road. He frowned. That can't be the river trail, he thought, his boots crunching over the gravel. It's too worn, too recently used. On the far side of the road, a stream flowed eastward, its waters glittering in the weak sunlight. It must flow into Orlac, he mused. The river can't be far now. As he wandered, his gaze caught a post with a sign. He hurried over to it and squinted at the text. The sign read, "Entering the village of Givatrun." Mylo's heart skipped a beat. He fell to his knees, tears springing to his eyes. "Thank you, Verdand," he whispered. He hadn't expected to find anything, but here it was, a village, a sign of hope, just when he needed it most. His stomach growled, reminding him of how desperately he needed food and rest. Just the thought of seeing people again nearly made him ecstatic. No one had spoken of a village this far north before, but Mylo wasn't about to complain. He stood up and looked at the sign once more. Looks like some form of old Atlantean, he murmured to himself. A town gifted by fate, maybe? How fitting. The road wound ahead, twisting through the landscape for about a mile. As he drew closer to the village, the sounds of voices and commotion reached his ears. He was nearly at the edge of the village when a horse and carriage passed him, heading in the direction he had just come from. "Good day, sir," called the driver, momentarily letting go of the reins to tip his hat. "It is certainly a good day, and the same to you," Mylo replied with a grin, watching as the man rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust. His eyes scanned the village, looking for an inn. The layout was surprisingly familiar, much like villages from his homeland. There was a temple to the Norn at the center, a statue of the town's founder nearby, and surrounding them, the grocer, butcher, and all the other essentials. To his relief, there was an inn not far from the stables. Mylo thought of Jack and whether his friend might be nearby. He furrowed his brow and closed his eyes, concentrating on reaching out to him with his thoughts. Suddenly, a voice cut through his concentration. "Are you all right?" a young woman asked, her tone concerned. Mylo blinked and opened his eyes to see a young couple looking at him with worry in their expressions. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you," he said quickly, trying to shake off the disorientation. "I was just thinking." "Oh, good," the woman said, relief evident in her voice. "Are you new to the village, or just passing through?" her husband asked. "We've had quite a few travelers pass through lately." "Just passing through," Mylo replied, his gaze shifting toward the inn. "I hope to stay for a day or two." He hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been nagging him. "Have either of you seen or heard of an elephant around here?" The man blinked, clearly confused. "A what?" "A large creature with tusks and a long snout," whispered the man's wife. The man shook his head in confusion. "No, sorry. Haven't seen anything like that." Mylo nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Well, thank you anyway." He gave them a brief smile before turning toward the inn, hoping to put the awkward moment behind him. Inside the inn, the warm air and the sight of the stables filled him with a sense of relief. There were already several horses in the stable, and 2 more arrived just before Mylo entered the building. "I hope there's a vacancy," he thought to himself. "Hello, sir," the innkeeper greeted him with a friendly smile. "If you're looking for a room, you're in luck. We've got space." The inn was modest, much like the town itself. The colors were natural, no fancy paints, rather the walls were finished in natural oils and varnishes offering protection from the elements. It wasn't much, but it was a warm, welcoming place. The innkeeper explained that business had been booming lately. "We've had so many customers. 2 days ago, we even had to turn some people away," he added with a proud smile. "I'll take a room," Mylo said, relieved. The innkeeper led him past the tavern area and up the stairs to the 2nd floor. "Your room's right down the hall, 3rd door on the right. There's a bath out back if you'd like to use it. It's a natural hot spring." He handed Mylo the key before heading off to take care of other business. Mylo opened the door to his room, which was simple but sufficient, a small bed, a desk, and a bin for storing clothes. It was warm and dry, a luxury after his travels. He went around back to the hot spring and marveled at the separate rooms that provided privacy. The hot water felt like heaven against his tired muscles. I could get used to this, he thought, sinking deeper into the water. Refreshed, Mylo returned to the inn, where the tavern was bustling with activity. All the seats at the bar were occupied, so he settled into a small table in a dark corner. He ordered a beer and quietly observed the crowd. It seemed like a peaceful gathering, much different from the rowdy crowds he'd seen in the walled city. He felt safe here. To his left, a few men were playing a game involving throwing knives. Men and women alike were chatting and laughing, and Mylo couldn't help but feel at ease, though he kept his beads close, ever watchful. Suddenly, 2 men entered the tavern. They didn't seem to belong. They had a quiet, purposeful air about them, and Mylo's instincts immediately told him they were outsiders. Shady, even. They sat at a table nearby and began speaking in low voices. Mylo got up and got another drink and briefly chatted with a pretty young lady at the bar. He sat back down and started to doze off. As he drifted off, he became aware of the conversation the 2 men were having. It was quite vivid when it was happening, but when he awoke, he could barely recall what they were talking about. Did I dream the whole conversation, or were they really talking about wizards gathering up in the mountains? He thought. He sipped his drink and scooted a bit closer to see if he could hear more. All he could make out was something about horses and their top speeds, then the conversation went silent. But just then, the two men stood and swiftly moved over to his table. "We know you were listening," said one of the men, his voice sharp. "How much did you hear?" asked the other. "Tell us." Mylo hesitated, trying to recall what he'd overheard. "I'm not sure. I heard something about. I have a friend who's a wizard and he trailed off." "Shush," the taller man warned. "Keep your voice down when speaking of such things." "You say you have a wizard friend?" asked the other man, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, Burdoc the Red," Mylo whispered. The two men exchanged a look, then shook their heads. "Never heard of him," the taller one said. "Let's go outside where there are fewer ears." They led him behind the stables, where they could speak privately. The taller man looked him over, assessing him with a wary eye. "How do we know you're not a spy?" he asked. "Government spies are everywhere. We need to be careful." "I'm no spy," Mylo replied, but he thought better than to mention the witch who had been pursuing him. "I led King Nemeshad's men into battle against the Col. "That was you," they interrupted. "Do you have proof of this?" Mylo showed them a few trinkets given to him by Whitfurrows, and the sword he had forged with the help of the blacksmith there. "This is all I have left," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Now, please, tell me what you have to tell me." Jaskreed and Lorne exchanged a look, then nodded to each other. "So here's the story and an offer," began Lorne. "As you probably know, the steward of Idriaxlan has claimed lordship over all of the lands of the Col and, from what I understand, he seeks control over all of Cameria. A persecution of all who stand in his way has begun. He has declared magical folks who will not do his bidding to be enemies of the state. There are even rumors that they round up any who are associated with them. But many wizards are too clever and have foreseen his plan." Jaskreed chimed in. "There is a gathering. A gathering of wizards in a great castle in the Keskipi Mountains across the lake. We are meeting a wizard here along with a few others, and we make for the castle in 2 days. Now here's the offer. Your friend Burdoc may be there, but there is no guarantee, but if he is aware of the gathering, he will be there. We need every noble person we can find. I believe a war like no other may be on the horizon. There is no course of action decided upon as of yet, but the gathering will determine it." Lorne continued. "You may join us if you would like. It will take about 5 days to get to the lake. The ferry going across will take up to a half day to cross the lake depending on the weather. Then another 2 days to the mountain and at least a day to climb it and find the castle, which may not be as easy as it sounds as it is cloaked in many spells." Mylo's mind was still on leaving Ashdorn, but his choices were to either continue on his own, not knowing where he was going, or to go back south on the river or stay in town. No matter what he did, he had a witch after him and he was running low on money, so he agreed to go with them. At least if Burdoc were at the gathering, he would know how to handle a murderous witch. "Okay, should I bring anything?" asked Mylo. "It is best to be prepared, but we have more than enough provisions. However, you will have to pay for your own ticket for the ferry. The last I heard it was about 50 cedros, or the equivalent in gold or silver. We meet on the eastern side of the stable at dawn, the morning after tomorrow. Until then, if you need anything or have any questions, we are in room number 4. It has been a long night. Stay out of trouble, Mylo." "We will see you around," said Lorne. "Good night." "And thank you," said Mylo. The men nodded and went back into the inn. Mylo was mentally and physically exhausted and had his fill of people watching for one day. He went back upstairs and fell sound asleep.